Alice Wilkins was a ghost, drifting through the halls of Westbrook High, unnoticed and forgotten. Her mousy brown hair and plain features blended seamlessly into the bustling crowd of teenagers, their laughter and chatter echoing off the lockers like a cacophony of indifference. Alice had acquaintances, sure, but no real friends, just a few familiar faces she exchanged polite nods with in the hallway before disappearing into the ebb and flow of the student body. At home, however, Alice's life was a waking nightmare. Her father, Robert, was a controlling, abusive man who had spiraled into a pit of rage and despair after the death of his wife when Alice was just a child. He watched her every move with a hawk-like intensity, his beady eyes narrowing at the slightest perceived infraction, his meaty fists clenched and ready to strike. Alice walked on eggshells, her every action calculated to avoid her father's wrath. As long as she maintained her straight-A average and stayed out of trouble, the beatings were kept to a minimum, just the occasional slap or punch to keep her in line. But deep down, Alice knew it was only a matter of time before her father's rage boiled over again, and she would be left nursing fresh bruises and a shattered spirit. It was on a crisp autumn day that everything changed. David Callahan, the star quarterback of the Westbrook Wolves and the object of desire for every girl in school, sauntered up to Alice as she was retrieving her books from her locker. His chiseled features and piercing blue eyes made Alice's heart flutter, and she felt a blush creep up her cheeks as he flashed her a dazzling smile. "Hey, Alice," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "I was wondering if you'd like to go out with me this weekend. Maybe catch a movie or something?" Alice's jaw dropped, her mind racing to process what was happening. David Callahan, the most popular guy in school, was asking her, the invisible girl, on a date? It had to be some kind of cruel prank, a twisted joke at her expense. But as she searched his face, she saw no trace of malice or deceit, only a genuine, hopeful expression. Yes, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd love to." The weekend felt like an eternity as Alice anxiously awaited her date with David. On Saturday morning, she woke up early, her stomach fluttering with a mix of excitement and nerves. She spent hours in front of the mirror, carefully applying a light touch of makeup and fussing over her hair. The simple yellow sundress she had picked out suddenly felt too plain, too ordinary for such a special occasion. As the afternoon dragged on, Alice found herself pacing back and forth in her bedroom, her mind racing with a million different scenarios. What if David stood her up? What if it was all just an elaborate prank? Or worse, what if her father found out about the date and flew into one of his violent rages? She pushed those thoughts aside, determined to enjoy this rare moment of happiness, no matter how fleeting it might be. Promptly at 7 o'clock, the rumble of David's sleek sports car echoed down the street, sending Alice's heart into a frenzy. She took one last look in the mirror, smoothing out the wrinkles in her sundress and trying in vain to tame her unruly hair. With a deep breath, she grabbed her purse and slipped out the front door, careful not to make a sound that might alert her father. As she slid into the passenger seat of David's car, the rich scent of leather enveloped her, and she couldn't help but run her fingers over the smooth, cool surface. David flashed her a dazzling smile, his blue eyes twinkling in the fading evening light. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice sending a shiver down Alice's spine. Instead of the movie theater, David surprised her by pulling into the parking lot of the annual spring carnival. Alice's eyes widened as she took in the colorful tents and blinking lights, the sounds of laughter and screams of delight filling the air. Hand in hand, they wandered through the bustling fairgrounds, taking in the sights and sounds of the carnival. David won her a stuffed teddy bear at the ring toss, his strong arm effortlessly tossing the rings onto the bottles. They shared a sticky sweet funnel cake, the powdered sugar dusting their noses and cheeks as they giggled like children. As the night wore on, they rode the Ferris wheel, the cool breeze whipping through their hair as they soared high above the fairgrounds. From their lofty perch, they could see the twinkling lights of the city in the distance, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of the carnival below. For those few precious hours, Alice felt truly alive, her worries and fears melting away in the warm glow of the carnival lights and the infectious joy of the crowd. She laughed and smiled more than she had in years, her heart swelling with a happiness she had almost forgotten existed. But as the night drew to a close and David walked her to her front door, a sense of dread began to creep back into her heart. Her father's car was in the driveway, and the living room light was on. He was awake, and he would know she had been out. Alice's hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys, her mind racing with excuses and explanations. But nothing could have prepared her for the fury that awaited her inside. Her father was a towering figure of rage, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred as he advanced on his daughter. "Where the hell have you been?" he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. Alice cowered, her body instinctively curling in on itself as she braced for the inevitable blows. I was just out with a friend, Dad," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. "A friend?" he roared, grabbing her by the hair and yanking her head back. "Or was it that boy I saw you with? You little slut, spreading your legs for the first guy who shows you attention?" The beatings that followed were the worst Alice had ever endured. Her father's fists rained down on her like a hailstorm, each blow more brutal than the last. She curled into a ball on the floor, her body a canvas of bruises and welts, her sobs echoing through the empty house. When it was finally over, and her father had retreated to his room in a drunken stupor, Alice dragged herself to the bathroom. She stared at her battered reflection in the mirror, her eyes swollen and her lips split, and she knew in that moment that she couldn't go on living like this. With trembling hands, Alice picked up a pen and a tattered scrap of paper, her vision blurred by the tears that streamed down her bruised cheeks. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady her nerves as she began to pour her heart out onto the page. "Dear David," she wrote, her handwriting shaky and uneven. "Thank you for the most wonderful night of my life. The spring carnival was like a dream come true, a brief escape from the nightmare that has become my reality." Alice paused, memories of their magical evening flooding her mind. The way David's eyes had crinkled at the corners when he smiled at her, the warmth of his hand as they wandered through the fairgrounds, fingers intertwined, the sweet, sugary taste of the funnel cake they had shared, the powdered sugar dusting their noses like a light snowfall. "For those few hours, I felt alive," she continued, her tears now falling freely, smearing the ink on the page. "You showed me what it was like to be truly happy, to feel seen and valued and cherished. It was the most incredible feeling in the world, and I will forever be grateful to you for that gift." Alice's hand trembled as she recalled the brutal beating she had endured at the hands of her father, the searing pain of his fists raining down upon her fragile body. The memory was seared into her mind, a constant reminder of the hell she lived in day after day. But now, the happiness I felt tonight has been replaced by a darkness so profound, so all-consuming, that I can no longer bear the weight of it, she wrote, her words becoming more frantic, more desperate. "My father's rage knows no bounds, and I fear that if I stay, he will eventually take my life in one of his violent outbursts." With a heavy heart, Alice folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, addressing it to David with shaky penmanship. She placed it on her nightstand, a final farewell to the one person who had shown her true kindness and joy, if only for a fleeting moment. The next morning, David arrived at school to a somber silence that hung heavy in the air. Clusters of students huddled together, whispering and casting furtive glances in his direction. A sense of dread washed over him as he made his way to his locker, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing down upon his shoulders. It was his friend Jake who finally broke the news, pulling David aside with a grave expression on his face. "Dude, it's Alice Wilkins," he said, his voice hushed and solemn. "She's dead. Killed herself last night." The words hit David like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. Alice, The shy, unassuming girl he had taken on a date just the night before, was gone. He couldn't wrap his mind around the idea, couldn't fathom the depths of despair that must have consumed her to take such a drastic action. As the day wore on, the horrific details began to trickle out. Alice's body had been discovered by her father, hanging from the rafters in their basement. The police were investigating, but the general consensus was that it had been a suicide, a tragic end to a life that had been filled with far too much pain and suffering. The police officer handed David an envelope, now sealed in an evidence bag, and David's hands trembled as he opened it, his eyes scanning the words that Alice had poured her heart into just hours before taking her own life. As he read, tears streamed down his face, his heart shattering into a million pieces. Alice's gratitude for the happiness he had brought her, however fleeting, was a stark contrast to the depths of her despair. She had been living in a waking nightmare, enduring unspeakable abuse at the hands of her own father, and that one night at the Carnival had been a brief respite, a glimpse of joy in a life that had been consumed by darkness. David wept openly, his body racked with sobs as the weight of his unintentional role in Alice's tragic end bore down upon him. He had only asked her out on a dare, a cruel bet made by his teammates to see if he could score a date with the school's resident wallflower. But in doing so, he had inadvertently given Alice a taste of happiness, a fleeting moment of joy that had ultimately made the darkness of her reality too much to bear. As he clutched the letter to his chest, David made a silent vow. He would never again treat someone with such callous disregard, never again be a party to such cruelty and heartlessness. Alice's memory would be a constant reminder of the power of kindness and the devastating impact of thoughtless actions. For in the end, it was not the physical scars that had broken Alice, but the emotional ones, the years of neglect and abuse that had slowly chipped away at her spirit until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. And in her final moments, it was the brief glimpse of happiness, of being seen and valued, that had given her the strength to let go, to escape the nightmare that had become her life. David would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his days, a bitter reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can have profound consequences, for better or for worse.